Beneath the familiar story of the Vikings lies something far older and far less understood. Long before the first longships carved their paths across the northern seas, fragments of another maritime world were already there, hidden in submerged harbours, buried in peat bogs, and scattered across storm-worn coastlines. No sagas clearly name them, no empire claims them. Yet the evidence suggests a vast seafaring network that may have once connected the entire far north. What happened to them? And why did their world disappear from memory almost completely? Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, because what the sea forgot is still waiting to be uncovered. The storm arrives without warning, rolling in from the outer northern sea like something older than weather itself. Fishermen who know these waters by instinct notice the change first. The sudden drop in pressure, the unnatural stillness that precedes the wind. Then the sea begins to rise in long, dark swells that do not behave like ordinary storm waves. They stack themselves into uneven walls, breaking against the coastline with a force that shakes loose more than foam and driftwood. In one narrow fjord where the cliffs tighten like a throat around the water, the storm pushes deeper than it should, dragging at the seabed and tearing at the silence that has settled there for centuries. When the wind finally eases days later, the coastline is unrecognizable in small but significant ways. Rocks that were once buried under sand now sit exposed. Lines of kelp have been pulled far inland, and among the scattered debris left behind by the sea's retreat, something unusual begins to appear along the tide line. At first it looks like ordinary storm wreckage, fragments of wood broken and worn smooth by salt and time. But the shape of some of these pieces resists that explanation. The curvature is too deliberate, the grain too preserved in places where it should have long since dissolved. These are not random branches or modern debris. They resemble worked timber, shaped by human hands with a purpose that is not immediately clear. Local reports, passed from village to village along the northern coast, describe the same unsettling detail. The wood is not fresh, yet it is not entirely ancient either. It carries the texture of something submerged for a long time but protected in strange ways, as if parts of it had been sealed away from decay. Some pieces are long and ribbed, others curve in a way that suggests hull construction. A few even show faint markings, worn and almost invisible, but still too regular to be natural erosion. The storm has not only reshaped the coastline, it has exposed something that should have remained buried beneath it. It is not the first time the northern seas have revealed fragments like this, but the scale of the discovery feels different. Coastal archaeologists arriving in the aftermath of the storm begin to document what has surfaced. What they find does not belong to any known medieval wreckage or Viking-era ship construction. The structural hints point to something earlier, more experimental, and oddly sophisticated in its own right. There are layered planks, fastening techniques that do not fully match known Scandinavian shipbuilding traditions, and traces of tar or resin that suggest deliberate preservation methods. The question begins to form almost immediately, quietly at first among specialists and then spreading outward into wider curiosity. If these fragments are genuinely older than the Viking Age, then who built them? The northern world before the Vikings is not a blank slate, but it is fragmented in the historical record. What survives is scattered across archaeology, linguistics, and myth, leaving large gaps where entire societies may have existed without ever being properly recorded. This discovery presses directly into one of those gaps, where absence has long been mistaken for emptiness. Further inland, where peat bogs preserve organic material in a near time capsule state, Similar wooden fragments have been reported in earlier decades. Some were dismissed as driftwood, others as remnants of local fishing craft. But when compared with the newly exposed material from the storm, the similarities become harder to ignore. The construction style suggests a coherent tradition, not isolated accidents. Something systematic may have once operated across these northern waters, something that understood the sea not as a boundary, but as a structured space for movement and exchange. The storm becomes more than a weather event in the retelling of coastal communities. It becomes a moment of revelation, a brief tearing open of time itself. In the days that follow, the shoreline is combed carefully, and every fragment is treated with increasing caution. Not because it is immediately understood, but because it feels like part of a larger story that has not yet been fully recovered. The sea, long known for hiding its past, has momentarily given something back. Modern marine survey teams are eventually called in, bringing sonar equipment and underwater mapping tools to trace what might remain offshore. What they begin to detect beneath the sediment layers complicates the picture further. Linear shapes lie just below the seabed in patterns that do not resemble natural formations. They are too regular, too aligned, suggesting either human intervention or a coincidence so precise it becomes statistically unlikely. Some appear to extend beyond the immediate storm zone, implying that whatever lies beneath the water is not the result of a single shipwreck, but part of something more extensive. At this stage, no definitive conclusion is drawn. The cautious language of archaeology takes over, emphasizing uncertainty, possible interpretations, and the need for further excavation. Yet even within that caution, a subtle shift occurs. Researchers begin to speak not just of isolated finds, but of a potential maritime tradition that predates the well-documented rise of Viking seafaring culture. It is not yet an empire in any formal sense, but the idea of a connected network begins to take shape in academic discussions. What makes the situation more compelling is the absence of written records that match these physical traces. The northern world does contain oral traditions and later sagas, but they are filtered through centuries of reinterpretation. If an earlier seafaring system existed, it would have had to leave its primary record in material form rather than text. Ships, harbours, trade goods, and environmental modifications would be the only surviving evidence, and the sea, for all its destructive power, would still occasionally return fragments of that lost record to the shore. Standing on the cliffs after the storm, it is easy to imagine the coastline as a kind of boundary between eras. Above, the present world of mapped waters, shipping routes, and modern navigation. Below, something older and partially erased, still shaped by human movement, but no longer fully legible. The fragments scattered along the tide line feel like punctuation marks in a language no one can yet read fluently. Before the wind rises again and the sea settles back into its long silence, one detail lingers in the accounts of those who witnessed the aftermath. Among the broken timber, there are traces of repeated craftsmanship, as if multiple ships or generations of builders shared the same underlying design principles. Not identical, but related, not random, but evolving. It is a subtle clue, but one that refuses to disappear. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. The storm passes, but it leaves behind a question that does not fade with the tide. If these fragments truly belong to a forgotten maritime tradition, then they are not just remnants of shipwrecks. They are echoes of a system of movement, trade, and survival that once operated across the northern seas long before the Vikings ever named them. Long before the Viking Age gives the northern seas a familiar name, there is a stretch of time that feels strangely unanchored, as if it exists between memory and silence. The coastlines are the same, the winds still carve the same violent paths across the water, and the long winter darkness still presses down for months at a time. Yet the human presence in this world is harder to pin down. It is there in fragments, in scattered archaeological traces, but it does not yet form the coherent image of kingdoms, sagas, or even clearly defined peoples. Instead, the North appears as a mosaic of overlapping cultures, each moving through the landscape without leaving a single dominant narrative behind. This is the world that existed before the Viking horizon came into focus, before longships became symbols of expansion and conquest. It is a world where the sea is already central, but not yet fully organized into the structured maritime identity later centuries would recognize. Coastal communities live in rhythm with the water, shaping their survival around tides, seasonal migrations of fish, and unpredictable weather systems that define the northern climate. But what is less visible in the written record is how deeply interconnected these communities may have been across vast stretches of coastline. Archaeology begins to fill in the silence, though slowly and unevenly. Settlements from this earlier period reveal a consistent reliance on marine resources, with fish bones, whale remains, and seal processing sites appearing far inland in some cases. This suggests not only coastal activity but systematic preservation and transport. People are not simply surviving off the sea, they are organizing their lives around it in ways that imply coordination beyond isolated villages. Yet without written accounts, the structure of that coordination remains speculative. In the absence of texts, the material record becomes the primary voice, and it is here that subtle patterns begin to emerge. Certain tool types appear across distant coastal regions, sharing design features that suggest either shared knowledge or repeated contact. Pottery fragments show stylistic similarities that do not align neatly with later ethnic divisions. Even burial practices in some coastal zones hint at maritime influence, with grave goods that include fishing implements, boat-related tools, and in rare cases, actual boat burials that predate the famous Viking examples by centuries. What is missing, however, is a unifying identity. The Viking Age would later project a recognizable cultural framework across the North, but in this earlier period, there is no single label that fits cleanly. This has led scholars to caution against imagining a unified empire or even a single people. Instead, what likely exists is a network of interacting groups, loosely connected through trade, seasonal movement, and shared maritime knowledge. The sea functions less as a barrier and more as a medium through which these interactions occur. And yet, the storm-exposed fragments from the coastline do not entirely fit this fragmented model. Their construction hints at something more consistent, more systematized than what is typically expected from loosely connected communities. This tension becomes one of the central questions for researchers trying to understand the deeper past of the northern seas. If no centralized state existed, how did such coherent shipbuilding traditions emerge and persist across distance and time? The answer may lie in the nature of maritime life itself. In the far north, the sea is not optional. It is not a boundary to be crossed occasionally, but a permanent feature of survival. Over generations, this creates pressures that naturally favor convergence in technology and design. Boats that work well in rough northern waters would be copied, adapted, and refined across communities that may never form political unity but still share environmental constraints. In this sense, similarity does not necessarily imply empire, it may simply reflect necessity. Still, necessity alone does not fully explain the complexity suggested by some of the archaeological finds. Certain coastal sites reveal evidence of organized production, where timber is processed in standardized ways, and construction debris suggests repeated shipbuilding activity rather than isolated craftsmanship. These are not the signs of occasional fishing craft. They suggest something more sustained. Possibly seasonal centres of maritime activity where knowledge was concentrated and passed along systematically. Peat bog discoveries add another layer to this emerging picture. In oxygen-poor environments where organic material is preserved for millennia, wooden objects have been recovered that show advanced joinery techniques. Some of these methods resemble later Viking construction, but others differ in subtle ways that suggest either regional variation or an earlier developmental stage in shipbuilding technology. The chronology is not always easy to establish, and radiocarbon dating often provides broad ranges rather than precise moments in time. Even so, the pattern is difficult to ignore. The northern sea routes themselves may have played a crucial role in shaping this hidden connectivity. Unlike inland travel, which is constrained by terrain and vegetation, maritime movement along coastlines allows for relatively efficient long-distance travel even in pre-modern conditions. Small stops along sheltered bays, river mouths, and natural harbours would have created a chain of contact points stretching across vast distances. Over time, these points could form a loose but persistent network, maintained not by political authority but by practical necessity. Within this framework, the idea of a forgotten seafaring empire becomes more complicated. The word empire implies centralized control, hierarchy, and formal governance. But what if the reality was something more fluid? A maritime culture so deeply embedded in the environment that it functioned as an interconnected system without needing a single ruling center. Such a system would leave traces, but not the kind of traces that fit neatly into historical categories. This is where interpretation becomes difficult. Archaeologists must balance the temptation to unify scattered evidence with the risk of over-interpreting coincidence. Similar tools do not always mean shared identity. Repeated ship designs do not necessarily indicate coordinated development, yet when multiple lines of evidence begin to converge, wooden fragments, settlement patterns, burial customs, and offshore anomalies, the possibility of a broader system becomes harder to dismiss entirely. The northern climate itself also plays a role in obscuring this past. Rising sea levels since the end of the last ice age have submerged coastal settlements, while shifting shorelines have erased ancient harbours. What once may have been thriving maritime hubs now lie beneath cold, sediment-heavy waters, inaccessible except when storms disturb the seabed or when advanced sonar mapping happens to pass over them. The ocean does not simply preserve history, it rearranges and conceals it. In this uncertain landscape, the storm that exposed the timber fragments takes on greater significance. It is not just a random event, but part of a long pattern of environmental forces that intermittently reveal what would otherwise remain hidden. Each exposure is temporary, a brief window into a deeper archaeological layer before the sea settles again and reclaims its silence. As researchers continue to map these patterns, a subtle shift begins to occur in how the past is imagined. Instead of viewing the northern world before the Vikings as a fragmented prelude to a more documented era, some begin to see it as a complex system in its own right, one that operated with its own logic and structure but left behind fewer readable records. The absence of clear evidence becomes less an absence of civilization and more an absence of preservation. And beneath that idea lies a more unsettling possibility. If a maritime system once existed at scale across these northern waters, then much of its story may never be recoverable in full. not because it did not exist, but because the sea has already taken too much of it back. The peat bog does not reveal its secrets in any hurry. It holds them the way cold water holds breath, suspending decay just long enough for chance to decide what survives and what vanishes. When the first wooden fragments are lifted from its dark surface, they come out heavy, saturated, and unexpectedly intact in places where time should have erased everything. The texture is wrong for modern driftwood, too dense, too evenly preserved, as if it had been deliberately protected rather than abandoned. In the northern regions where these bogs spread across lowland terrain, archaeologists have long understood that they are not simply wetlands. They are archives without shelves, storing fragments of human activity in layers that stretch back thousands of years. Some of the recovered pieces resemble ship components, though not in the straightforward sense of recognizable hull sections. Instead, they appear as structural intermediaries, curved timber sections that suggest complex assembly rather than simple construction. There are fastening points that indicate joining systems more sophisticated than basic lashings or nails, and in a few cases, traces of resin-based sealing compounds that hint at intentional waterproofing techniques. These are not crude fishing rafts assembled in haste. They belong to a tradition that understood the demands of cold, unpredictable waters and responded with engineering rather than improvisation. What makes these finds particularly intriguing is not just their design, but their distribution. Similar fragments have been discovered across widely separated coastal bogs, from sheltered inlets to inland wetlands that once lay closer to ancient shorelines. This spread suggests either repeated independent innovation or, more plausibly, a shared technological tradition that travelled with people as they moved along the coast. Yet no written record identifies the builders. No named culture in later historical sources clearly claims ownership of this maritime knowledge. At the same time, underwater surveys along the northern seabed begin to produce complementary evidence. Sonar scans reveal linear anomalies buried beneath layers of sediment, some forming near parallel arrangements that resemble harbour structures or ship mooring zones. In a few locations, the seabed appears subtly reshaped, as though repeated anchoring or dredging activity had altered its natural contours long before modern navigation charts were drawn. The deeper these surveys go, the more the ocean floor begins to resemble a palimpsest, overwritten by both natural processes and human activity that predates recorded history. The challenge, however, lies in interpretation. Natural geological formations can sometimes mimic human patterns, especially in dynamic coastal environments where ice movement, sediment deposition, and tidal forces constantly reshape the landscape. Distinguishing between intentional construction and natural alignment requires careful analysis, and even then, certainty is rarely absolute. This is why scholars remain cautious, describing these features as possible anthropogenic structures rather than definitive evidence of ancient ports or shipyards. Still, when multiple lines of evidence begin to converge, caution starts to coexist uneasily with curiosity. The bog-preserved timber suggests advanced construction. The seabed anomalies suggest organized maritime activity. Coastal settlements from the same broad time period show dependence on marine resources at a scale that implies coordinated exploitation. Each piece on its own is ambiguous, but together they form a pattern that is increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. One of the most striking aspects of this emerging picture is the apparent consistency in material selection. Certain types of wood appear repeatedly in ship-related contexts, often favouring flexible yet durable species that respond well to cold water conditions. This suggests not only practical knowledge of local environments, but also a transmission of preferences and techniques across generations. In societies without centralized record-keeping, such knowledge would have been preserved orally and through apprenticeship, making it inherently fragile and easily lost when social structures collapse or migrate. And collapse, in the northern world, is never far away. Climate fluctuations, resource shifts, and environmental instability have repeatedly reshaped human settlement patterns across the region. Periods of relative warmth allow expansion along coastlines and deeper into marginal zones, while colder phases force contraction and abandonment. In such a system, maritime mobility becomes not just advantageous but essential. Communities that can move, adapt, and maintain contact across distances are more likely to survive long-term environmental stress. This may help explain why maritime technology appears so persistently across disparate archaeological sites. It is not necessarily the product of a single empire or centralized authority, but the outcome of repeated adaptation to a harsh and changing environment. Over time, successful solutions to shared problems tend to converge, producing similarities that can later be mistaken for cultural unity. Yet even this explanation does not fully account for certain anomalies. In a few bog sites, wooden fragments show repair marks that suggest long-term vessel maintenance rather than single-use construction. These repairs indicate ownership, investment, and repeated deployment over time. Ships are not just built and discarded, they are maintained, suggesting sustained use and possibly organized fleets operating along established routes. The question then shifts from who built these vessels to how they were organized in life. If there was no formal state, no documented kingdom, then what kind of social structure supported such maritime activity? Some researchers propose seasonal assembly points, where coastal groups gathered during specific times of year to coordinate travel, exchange goods, and repair vessels. Others suggest more fluid hierarchies based on expertise, where skilled navigators and shipbuilders held influence without formal political structures. What remains consistent across interpretations is the importance of the sea as connective tissue. Unlike land-based societies that often define themselves through territorial boundaries, these northern communities appear to have been shaped by movement. Identity may have been less about fixed settlement and more about participation in shared routes, seasonal cycles, and maritime knowledge systems that transcended individual villages. This perspective changes how the recovered fragments are understood. They are no longer just remnants of isolated shipwrecks or abandoned tools. They become evidence of participation in a broader, largely invisible network of movement. Each piece of timber, each repair mark, each sonar anomaly contributes to a larger but still incomplete picture of how people once navigated a world where water was the primary medium of connection. And yet, despite all this emerging coherence, a fundamental gap remains. There is still no name for this system, no surviving inscription that identifies its builders or describes its structure. The sea has preserved fragments of activity, but not the narrative that once bound them together. What survives is material, not linguistic, structural, not conceptual. In that silence, interpretation becomes both necessary and uncertain. The temptation to assemble these fragments into a single empire grows stronger with each discovery, but the evidence resists such simplicity. What appears instead is something more diffuse, a maritime tradition so deeply embedded in the environment that it functioned without needing centralized definition, yet still capable of leaving behind traces of remarkable consistency. As the peat bog continues to yield its slow revelations and the seabed mapping expands into deeper waters, one thing becomes increasingly clear. The northern seas were never empty before the Vikings. They were occupied by a complex and adaptive human presence that understood the water not as emptiness, but as structure. What remains uncertain is not whether this presence existed, but how far it extended, and how much of it still lies hidden beneath the cold, shifting layers of the ocean floor. The idea that ships can exist before empires is not unusual, but the idea that shipbuilding traditions can outlast the memory of the people who built them changes how the northern world begins to look. Beneath the later Viking horizon, beneath the sagas and the carved stones and the familiar silhouette of long ships cutting through grey water, there are faint signs of earlier vessels that do not quite belong to any named culture. They appear not as a single breakthrough, but as a gradual accumulation of maritime knowledge that seems to have matured in place, shaped by water, wind, and necessity rather than sudden invention. When archaeologists study the recovered timbers from bog sites and coastal deposits, one feature stands out with quiet consistency. The construction is not primitive. It is deliberate, structured, and often surprisingly efficient for the conditions it was meant to endure. Curved planks suggest hulls designed to flex with waves rather than resist them rigidly. Fastening points indicate repairability, meaning these vessels were expected to survive multiple voyages rather than serve as single-use craft. Even the choice of overlapping joins in some fragments implies an understanding of hydrodynamic stress that does not feel accidental. In the absence of surviving complete ships, reconstruction becomes an exercise in pattern recognition. Small fragments must be assembled mentally into larger systems, and each system must be tested against what is known about northern seas. Strong currents, sudden storms, shallow coastlines, and hidden reefs all impose strict constraints on maritime design. Any vessel that survived in this environment for long periods would need to balance stability with flexibility, weight with maneuverability, and durability with ease of repair. The fragments recovered so far suggest that such a balance was not only achieved but refined over time. It is here that the comparison with later Viking longships becomes both useful and misleading. On the surface, there are similarities. Both traditions emphasize shallow draft, speed, and coastal navigation. Both rely on clinker-built construction techniques in which overlapping planks form a flexible hull. But the earlier fragments do not always align perfectly with the standardized forms seen in the Viking Age. Some structural differences hint at experimentation, regional variation, or developmental stages that were later streamlined into more recognizable designs. The question is not whether there is a connection, but how direct that connection actually is. In certain coastal excavation sites, particularly those exposed during low-tide erosion events, post holes and mooring traces suggest repeated docking activity over long periods. These are not isolated landings, but organized patterns of arrival and departure. The spacing of these marks implies a level of planning, possibly indicating designated harbour zones or seasonal landing points. If this interpretation is correct, then maritime activity was not sporadic. It was structured, recurring, and embedded into the rhythm of coastal life. Yet no written system accompanies this infrastructure. There are no inscriptions naming ports, no markers identifying ownership, no formal records of trade agreements. Everything that suggests organization is material rather than textual. This creates a peculiar historical imbalance. The infrastructure of movement is visible, but the language of that movement is missing. It is as if the physical world has preserved the skeleton of a system whose cultural identity has been erased. Some scholars suggest that this absence may be due to the nature of the societies involved. In small-scale or semi-nomadic coastal groups, knowledge often resides in oral tradition, and practical repetition rather than written documentation. Routes are memorized. Seasonal patterns are learned through experience, and maritime skills are passed down through apprenticeship. In such systems, there is little need for formal records, because continuity is maintained through lived practice rather than archived instruction. But this also means that when those practices disappear, they leave almost no linguistic trace behind. Environmental change may have played a decisive role in this disappearance. Northern climates are not static. They shift in cycles that can alter coastlines, fish migration patterns, and navigability of sea routes. A relatively small temperature change can extend or shorten sailing seasons, forcing communities to adapt rapidly or abandon established routes entirely. Over generations, such shifts can fragment once coherent networks into isolated pockets of survival. Evidence from paleoclimate studies suggests that the centuries preceding the Viking Age included periods of notable variability. Some phases were warmer, allowing expansion along northern coasts. Others were colder, tightening survival pressures and restricting movement. In this unstable context, maritime systems would have needed to be highly adaptable. A flexible network of routes and seasonal interactions would be more resilient than centralized control, which can collapse under environmental stress. This might explain why the archaeological record shows consistency in technique but variability in form. Knowledge persists even when political or social structures do not. Shipbuilding methods can survive migration, fragmentation, and even cultural transformation because they are embedded in practical necessity. A fisherman does not need to belong to a kingdom to know how to build a seaworthy vessel. He only needs access to wood, experience of the water, and inherited knowledge of what works. And yet, some findings still resist simple explanation. In a few extraordinary cases, wooden fragments show signs of standardized measurement systems. Repeated proportional relationships between structural components suggest that some form of shared technical convention may have existed across wide distances. This does not necessarily imply formal governance, but it does suggest communication at a level more advanced than isolated communities independently arriving at identical solutions. Such conventions could have spread through itinerant craftsmen, seasonal gatherings, or long-distance trading routes. In the absence of writing, technical standards can still propagate through practice. A successful ship design observed in one coastal region can be copied, adapted, and transmitted along maritime corridors over generations. Over time, this can produce the appearance of uniformity without requiring centralized authority. The sea itself encourages this kind of diffusion. Unlike land-based travel, which is constrained by geography and political boundaries, maritime movement along coastlines is fluid and continuous. Harbours act as nodes in a larger network, each one connecting to the next in a chain that stretches across thousands of kilometers. In such a system, innovation spreads not through decree, but through repetition and observation. As more fragments are studied, a quiet shift begins to occur in interpretation. What once looked like isolated anomalies now appears as part of a broader, if still undefined, maritime culture. Not an empire in the traditional sense, but not entirely fragmented either. Something in between. A distributed system of knowledge, movement, and survival that operated across the northern seas long before written history began to describe them. And still, beneath this growing picture, there remains a sense of incompleteness. Every new discovery answers one question while raising another. Every reconstructed vessel hints at a fleet that cannot be fully seen. Every coastal site suggests activity that extends beyond its immediate boundaries. The northern seas, even when partially mapped through archaeology, refuse to settle into a single coherent narrative. What emerges instead is a landscape of movement without origin points, structure without centralization, and continuity without name. It is a reminder that history is not only what is recorded, but also what survives in fragments too scattered to assemble fully. And somewhere beneath the cold northern waters, more of those fragments likely still remain, waiting for storms, tides, or chance to bring them briefly back into view. The northern coast does not behave like a single continuous landscape. It breaks into fragments of fjords, islands, inlets, and long exposed shorelines where the wind seems to have been given unlimited space to move. For any human society trying to survive here, the geography demands adaptation rather than control. Movement becomes more important than settlement, and routes matter more than borders. In such an environment, a maritime way of life does not emerge as a choice. It emerges as the only viable structure for long-term survival. The scattered evidence from earlier sections begins to take on a more coherent shape when viewed through this lens. The timber fragments, the bog-preserved ship components, the seabed anomalies, and the recurring construction patterns all point toward one underlying reality. The sea was not simply a resource, but a framework for organization. Communities along these coasts likely depended on regular movement across water, not only for trade, but for social connection, seasonal planning, and access to resources that were unevenly distributed across land. In this world, a single coastal village is never truly isolated. Even if it appears so in the archaeological record, it would have been embedded in a wider rhythm of maritime contact. Fishing grounds shift with currents, whale migrations follow predictable but distant paths, and trade goods such as amber, iron, and animal products often require long-distance exchange to reach optimal value. The sea becomes a connecting surface that links otherwise separated communities into a functional network. What begins to emerge from this pattern is not a centralized empire, but something more fluid and less visible. A maritime culture shaped by repetition, necessity, and shared environmental constraints. It is a system held together not by political authority, but by the reliability of routes and the predictability of seasonal cycles. Ships are the instruments of this system, but the system itself exists in the movement between points rather than within any single location. Archaeological evidence supports this idea in subtle but persistent ways. Coastal settlements from the relevant time periods show signs of cyclical occupation. Some sites appear heavily used during certain seasons and nearly abandoned during others. This suggests a rhythm of movement rather than permanent habitation. People may have moved between inland resource zones and coastal maritime hubs depending on the time of year, following patterns that were likely stable over generations. In such a system, ships are not luxury objects or rare technological achievements. They are essential infrastructure. Their design reflects this importance. The recovered fragments suggest vessels built for repeated use, maintenance, and adaptation. Repair marks are common, indicating that ships were valued long-term assets rather than disposable tools. This implies an economy of effort where building a vessel was a significant investment, justified only if it supported continuous maritime activity. The materials themselves reveal further clues. The preference for specific wood types, the use of resin sealing techniques, and the standardized approaches to plank construction suggest accumulated knowledge rather than isolated experimentation. Even without centralized coordination, successful designs would naturally spread along routes where experienced sailors and craftsmen interacted repeatedly. Over time, This produces convergence, where different groups arrive at similar solutions because the environment filters out less effective alternatives. Yet even within this convergence, variation persists. Some fragments show regional differences in curvature, fastening style, and structural reinforcement. These differences may reflect local adaptations to specific coastal conditions. A vessel designed for the open Atlantic coast would differ slightly from one intended for sheltered fjord navigation or riverine travel. This diversity within a broader pattern reinforces the idea of a shared tradition rather than a uniform system imposed from above. One of the more intriguing aspects of the archaeological record is the presence of what appear to be organized production zones along certain stretches of coastline. These are not cities in the later sense, but they show repeated evidence of woodworking, tar production, rope making, and fish processing. The scale of activity suggests coordinated effort, possibly seasonal aggregation sites where multiple groups gathered to build, repair, and prepare vessels for upcoming voyages. Such gathering points would have played a crucial role in maintaining continuity across a distributed maritime culture. They would function as nodes of knowledge transfer, where techniques are shared, designs are refined, and social ties are reinforced. In the absence of written communication, these physical meetings become essential for preserving consistency across time and distance. A ship built in one region could carry design influences from another simply through the movement of craftsmen and sailors. It is within these nodes that the idea of a hidden maritime system becomes more tangible. Not an empire with borders and rulers, but a network of interconnected practices sustained by repeated interaction. The system would not need central authority to function, only enough stability in environmental conditions and human movement to maintain continuity, and for a time, it appears that such stability may have existed. Climate data reconstructed from ice cores and sediment layers suggests that certain periods before the Viking Age were relatively stable in terms of temperature and sea ice distribution. These conditions would have allowed predictable navigation routes along the northern coastline. Predictability is crucial for any maritime system because it reduces risk and enables planning. Under such conditions, even loosely organized networks can achieve high levels of coordination. However, stability in the north is never permanent. Environmental systems shift, sometimes gradually and sometimes abruptly. A change in prevailing winds, a shift in ocean currents, or a period of cooling can disrupt established routes and force rapid adaptation. When this happens, maritime networks either reorganize or fragment. The archaeological record hints that such disruptions did occur, leaving gaps in settlement continuity and changes in material culture patterns. These disruptions may help explain why the maritime system inferred from the fragments does not appear as a continuous, clearly defined civilization. Instead, it appears as a series of overlapping phases, each shaped by environmental constraints and human adaptation. Knowledge persists, but its organizational structure changes. Ships continue to be built, but their designs evolve. Routes remain in use, but their importance shifts over time. The absence of a single defining identity for this maritime culture may therefore be misleading. It may not represent a lack of complexity, but rather a form of complexity that does not align with later historical expectations. Modern interpretations often search for boundaries, names, and hierarchies, but the northern seas may have supported a different kind of system, one defined by movement rather than permanence. Still, questions remain unresolved. If such a system existed, why did it leave so little direct trace in written history? Why do later sources describe the Viking Age as if it emerges from relative obscurity rather than from an already connected maritime world. Part of the answer may lie in the fragility of transmission. Oral traditions can fade, material cultures can be repurposed, and environmental change can erase physical infrastructure faster than it can be studied. The sea itself contributes to this erasure. Coastal erosion, sediment movement, and rising sea levels since the end of the last major cold period have submerged or destroyed countless ancient sites. What remains accessible is only a fraction of what once existed. Each storm that exposes fragments today may be revealing the last surviving edges of a much larger system that has already been mostly reclaimed by the ocean. And so the picture remains incomplete. A maritime world emerges from scattered evidence, but it does so without a clear origin point or final form. It exists in traces, in patterns, and in echoes that resist full reconstruction. What can be said with confidence is only that the northern seas were once far more actively inhabited than silence would suggest. Everything beyond that remains suspended between evidence and disappearance. The northern seas are not empty even when they appear still. Beneath the surface, currents continue to move in layered patterns. Cold water sliding under warmer flows, carrying sediment, organic material, and the occasional trace of human presence across distances that no single coastal community could fully track. In this environment, movement is not just something humans perform on the surface, it is something the sea itself participates in, reshaping what is preserved and what is lost. When trade is mentioned in the context of the ancient North, it is often imagined in simple terms one group exchanging goods with another, small networks connecting nearby settlements. But the emerging evidence from maritime fragments and coastal sites suggests something more complex. The distribution of materials like amber, iron, whalebone, and high-quality timber points toward exchange systems that extend across vast stretches of coastline. These are not isolated interactions. They resemble a web, where goods move through multiple hands before reaching their final destinations. Amber, in particular, becomes a quiet indicator of long-distance connectivity. Found in burial sites far from its natural coastal sources, it implies sustained movement along northern and Baltic shorelines. Iron artifacts show similar patterns, with certain metallurgical signatures appearing across widely separated regions. Even whale products, which require specialized knowledge to harvest and process, appear in contexts that suggest redistribution rather than local consumption alone. None of this requires a centralized authority, but it does require continuity of contact. Ships, in this system, are the enabling technology. Without reliable vessels capable of handling rough coastal waters, such exchange would collapse into short-range interactions. The structural evidence from recovered timbers supports the idea that these vessels were not rare or exceptional. They were part of a broader economic rhythm. Their repeated repair marks and standardized construction features suggest a sustained production culture, where maintaining a fleet of working ships was an ongoing necessity rather than a sporadic effort. What is striking is how quietly this system appears to have operated. There are no grand inscriptions, no monumental harbour complexes comparable to later classical civilizations, and no written accounts describing a unified maritime empire. Instead, what exists is a distributed pattern of activity, visible only when viewed across large spatial and temporal scales. Individual sites appear modest, even unremarkable, but together they form a coherent structure of movement. Some coastal excavation zones reveal evidence of what might be interpreted as staging areas for trade. These are locations where multiple types of material remains overlap fish processing waste, woodworking debris, tar residues, and imported objects that do not match local geological or ecological profiles. The density of activity suggests periodic gatherings rather than permanent occupation. In such places, goods could be exchanged, vessels repaired, and crews reorganized before continuing along established routes. These staging areas are particularly important because they hint at coordination without centralization. Instead of a single governing center directing trade, the system may have relied on shared understanding of routes, seasons, and mutual dependence. In a harsh environment, cooperation often emerges not from political unity, but from practical necessity. If one harbour fails, others along the route become more important. If one group cannot supply a needed resource, another compensates. Over time, this creates resilience through redundancy. Still, the scale of interaction implied by the archaeological record is difficult to ignore. It suggests that northern maritime communities were not merely isolated coastal groups, but participants in a broader economic landscape that stretched across regions later considered culturally distinct. The boundaries we now draw between prehistoric groups may not have been as meaningful in practice as they appear in retrospect. One of the more subtle indicators of this connectivity lies in the consistency of certain craft techniques. Rope-making methods, tar production processes, and even fish drying practices show similarities across distant sites. These are not easily standardized through written instruction in this period, which suggests they were transmitted through repeated observation and apprenticeship. A sailor or craftsman moving between coastal communities would carry not only goods, but also knowledge. This movement of people is as important as the movement of materials. Maritime systems depend on experience, and experience is portable. A skilled navigator who understands wind patterns, coastal currents, and seasonal hazards becomes a living repository of environmental knowledge. In a world without charts or compasses, such individuals are essential infrastructure. Their movement between communities ensures that knowledge does not remain isolated. Over time, this creates what might be described as a cultural gradient rather than a fixed cultural boundary. Practices shift gradually along coastlines, influenced by contact, environment, and adaptation. The result is a continuous zone of shared maritime behaviour, even if no single identity encompasses it. This gradient can easily be mistaken for fragmentation when viewed through the lens of later historical categories. The question of organisation remains central. How does a system of this scale function without centralised control? The answer may lie in repetition and predictability. Seasonal cycles impose structure on movement. Fish runs, weather patterns, and daylight variation all create windows of opportunity that are widely understood. When many groups respond to the same environmental cues in similar ways, coordination emerges naturally without requiring formal governance. In this sense, the sea itself becomes a regulator of human activity. It dictates when travel is possible, when fishing is productive, and when storms make movement impossible. Human systems built around such constraints tend to synchronize even in the absence of communication. Over generations, this produces a form of emergent order that can appear deceptively organized from the outside. Yet even this explanation does not fully resolve the complexity suggested by the archaeological record. Certain anomalies persist, particularly in regions where structural remains hint at more sustained and possibly hierarchical organization. Some harbour-like formations appear too deliberately arranged to be purely opportunistic. Their layout suggests planning beyond immediate seasonal need, implying that in at least some areas, more structured coordination may have existed. Whether this represents localized centers of authority or simply long-term accumulation of repeated use remains uncertain. The evidence does not clearly distinguish between planned infrastructure and organically developed patterns that happen to converge into structured forms over time. This ambiguity is one of the defining challenges in interpreting the northern maritime past. What is becoming increasingly clear, however, is that the sea functioned as more than a physical space. It was an economic system, a communication network, and a cultural medium. It shaped how people moved, how they interacted, and how knowledge persisted across generations. Any attempt to understand the societies that lived along these coasts must therefore begin not on land, but on water. As research continues, each new fragment adds to a growing sense that the northern world before the Vikings was neither empty nor simple. It was active, interconnected, and deeply adapted to maritime life. But it was also fragile, dependent on conditions that could shift without warning. In such a system, continuity is never guaranteed. It must be constantly rebuilt through movement, cooperation, and shared understanding of an environment that is never fully stable. And beneath the cold surface of the northern seas, that unfinished story still lies scattered, waiting for the next disturbance to briefly bring it back into view. At the edge of the northern world, where the sea narrows into channels between land masses that seem almost fragmented, contact is inevitable. No coastline exists in true isolation here. Even the most remote fjord eventually opens into a route that leads elsewhere, and every sheltered inlet becomes part of a larger chain of movement. It is in these transitional spaces, neither fully land nor fully open sea, that interaction between groups becomes most intense. Archaeological patterns suggest that the maritime system hinted at in earlier evidence did not operate in isolation from neighbouring cultures. Instead, it functioned within a broader northern ecology of exchange that included inland hunter-gatherer groups, early agricultural communities, and specialized coastal populations. These groups did not exist as rigidly separated entities. Their boundaries were porous, shaped more by environment and seasonal movement than by fixed territorial claims. The northern coastlines during this period are best understood as zones of overlap. Here, different ways of life intersect. Inland groups bring furs, meat, and forest resources toward the coast. Coastal groups provide fish, processed marine products, and access to long-distance maritime routes. In some regions, evidence suggests that these interactions were not occasional but routine, embedded into annual cycles of movement that repeated across generations. Within this system, maritime groups occupy a particularly important position. They control mobility across water, which in the northern context is often more efficient than land travel. This gives them access to distant resources and contact with multiple communities. However, this does not automatically translate into political dominance. Influence in such a system is often situational, dependent on knowledge of routes, weather, and timing rather than formal authority. The evidence for interaction comes in subtle forms. Shared artifact style appear across inland and coastal sites, suggesting exchange or imitation. Certain types of metalwork show consistent technological influences that cannot be explained by isolated development. Even dietary patterns, reconstructed through isotopic analysis of human remains, indicate occasional mixing of marine and terrestrial food sources in communities that otherwise appear distinct in their material culture. One of the most intriguing indicators of contact is the distribution of non-local materials in burial contexts. Objects made from distant resources appear in graves far from their origin points, implying that goods travel through multiple exchanges before reaching their final placement. These items are often symbolic rather than purely functional, suggesting that they carried meaning as well as material value. In such cases, maritime routes serve not only economic purposes but also cultural transmission. The northern seafaring tradition inferred from ship fragments and harbour traces likely played a central role in enabling this broader network. By connecting distant coastal zones, it creates pathways through which both goods and ideas can circulate. But the groups using these routes are not necessarily unified. They may share knowledge without sharing identity, participate in the same systems without recognizing themselves as part of a single entity. This distinction is important. Modern interpretations often seek to classify ancient societies into clearly defined cultural units. Yet the evidence from the northern seas suggests a more fluid reality. Identity in this context may have been layered and situational. A person could belong to a local settlement, participate in a seasonal maritime network, and interact with inland groups, all without any single overarching identity defining them. Interactions with neighbouring inland cultures introduce further complexity. In some regions, archaeological layers show alternating periods of coastal and inland dominance, suggesting shifts in subsistence strategies over time. Environmental changes may have pushed groups toward the sea during certain periods and back inland during others. This oscillation creates a dynamic cultural landscape in which boundaries are constantly renegotiated. Trade, in this context, is not a separate activity but an extension of survival strategies. Resources are unevenly distributed across the northern environment. Fish are abundant in coastal waters, but absent inland. Game animals migrate through forests but are scarce near shorelines at certain times of year. Stone, wood, metal ores, and salt each follow different geographical distributions. Exchange becomes necessary not as a luxury, but as a structural requirement for balanced survival. The maritime system allows this exchange to scale across distance. Coastal groups act as intermediaries, linking inland producers with distant markets that may span hundreds or even thousands of kilometres. Over time, this creates a layered network in which goods pass through multiple hands, accumulating complexity and meaning as they move. The sea becomes the primary medium through which this system operates, reducing the friction of distance and terrain. Yet despite this apparent integration, there is no evidence of a centralized governing structure coordinating these interactions. No administrative centers, no standardized taxation systems, and no written records of trade regulation survive from this period. Instead, coordination appears to emerge from repeated practice. Shared expectations about timing, routes, and exchange points are reinforced through repetition rather than enforcement. This type of system is resilient in some ways and fragile in others. It can adapt quickly to local conditions because it is not rigidly controlled. However, it is also vulnerable to disruption. A change in climate, a shift in resource availability, or a breakdown in key routes can ripple through the entire network without any central mechanism to stabilize it. The archaeological record shows signs of such disruptions, though their exact causes remain difficult to isolate. In certain coastal regions, settlement patterns abruptly change after specific environmental phases. Sites that were once active become abandoned, while new locations emerge elsewhere along the coast. This suggests migration rather than collapse, but the continuity of knowledge is harder to trace. Some technological traditions persist, while others disappear without clear explanation. The maritime system appears to reorganize rather than simply continue unchanged. The role of neighboring cultures in this process cannot be ignored. Contact between groups may have introduced new techniques, altered trade routes, or shifted economic priorities. In some cases, inland communities may have gained greater importance, reducing the relative centrality of maritime exchange. In others, coastal adaptation may have intensified, reinforcing seafaring traditions as primary survival strategies. What emerges from this complexity is not a single historical narrative, but a layered system of interactions. The northern world before the Vikings is not a blank prelude to a later age. It is a dense and dynamic environment in its own right, shaped by continuous negotiation between land, sea, climate, and human movement. The seafaring tradition inferred from the fragments is only one part of this larger picture, but it is a crucial one, connecting disparate regions into a functioning whole. And yet, even as patterns of interaction become clearer, the underlying structure remains elusive. There is still no definitive framework that explains how all these elements fit together. The sea connects them, but does not define them. It enables movement, but does not preserve identity. What remains is a system visible only in fragments, reconstructed through careful interpretation of what has survived. Beneath the waves, where sediment continues to shift and currents reshape the seabed, it is likely that more evidence of this system still exists. Each discovery so far has expanded the boundaries of what is possible, suggesting that the true extent of northern maritime connectivity may have been far greater than previously imagined. But until more of that submerged record is recovered, much of this world remains suspended between clarity and disappearance. There are moments in archaeological research when scattered evidence stops behaving like isolated fragments and begins to resemble a structure that was never fully erased, only partially buried. The northern maritime system reaches that threshold in the collective findings from ship timbers, coastal settlements, and seabed anomalies. What once appeared as unrelated traces of activity now begins to align into something that resembles scale, not in the political sense of borders and capitals, but in the sense of reach, coordination, and sustained presence across distance. The peak of this hidden maritime network is not marked by monuments or written declarations. It is inferred through repetition, harbour zones that show continuous use over centuries, shipbuilding techniques that remain stable across wide geographical areas, trade materials that move in consistent patterns from source regions to distant settlements. The system is visible not as a single event, but as a long-duration equilibrium, where movement across water becomes a defining feature of northern life. At this stage, the sea functions almost like an extension of the land. Coastal populations do not simply live beside it, they operate through it. Routes are not occasional paths but expected corridors of movement. Certain headlands, river mouths, and sheltered bays repeatedly appear in the archaeological record as points of convergence. These are not cities in the later sense, but they behave like functional nodes within a distributed network. The ships that enabled this system, reconstructed from fragmented remains, suggest a level of reliability that implies routine rather than rarity. They were not experimental craft used sporadically. They were workhorses of a maritime economy, built, repaired, and replaced in cycles that mirror the rhythms of coastal life. The presence of standardized repair marks indicates that maintenance was expected, planned, and integrated into usage patterns. A vessel was not an endpoint of production, but a continuing investment. What makes this phase of the northern maritime world particularly striking is its quietness in the historical record. There are no surviving texts describing fleets, voyages, or centralized coordination. Yet the material evidence suggests sustained and organized movement at a scale that would normally leave narrative traces in literate societies. The absence of such records does not imply absence of activity. Instead, it suggests that the system operated entirely outside written documentation, relying on oral transmission, experiential knowledge, and habitual practice. In some regions, particularly along sheltered coastlines, evidence points towards semi-permanent maritime hubs. These are locations where ship repair debris accumulates over long periods, where imported materials appear regularly, and where environmental modifications suggest repeated human intervention. Wooden posts embedded in sediment layers indicate anchoring systems used over generations. These sites do not develop into cities, but they function as stable points within an otherwise fluid landscape. The organization of such hubs likely depended on seasonal timing. The northern environment imposes strict cycles on movement. Ice formation restricts access for months at a time. Storm seasons make certain routes dangerous or impassable. Fish migrations and animal movements create predictable windows of resource availability. Within these constraints, human activity becomes synchronized not by command, but by shared environmental timing. This synchronization creates a form of natural coordination. Different groups, responding independently to the same environmental signals, arrive at similar places at similar times. Over centuries, this repetition hardens into tradition. Meeting points become expected. Routes become habitual. Knowledge of timing becomes as important as knowledge of geography. The system stabilizes not through enforcement, but through repetition reinforced by survival success. At its height, this maritime network likely supported a level of regional integration that modern categories struggle to describe. It was not a state, not a kingdom, and not a formal empire. Yet it connected vast stretches of coastline into a functioning system of exchange and movement. Goods travelled long distances not because they were directed by authority, but because they were carried along predictable chains of interaction. Certain artifacts found far from their origin points reinforce this idea. Objects made from specialized materials appear in contexts that suggest multiple stages of transfer. A single item might pass through several hands, each embedded in different communities along the coast. By the time it reaches its final location, its journey reflects not a single transaction, but a sequence of interactions spanning regions and generations. This layered movement of goods implies an equally layered movement of people. Mariners, traders, craftsmen, and seasonal travellers likely formed a mobile population that connected distant communities. Their knowledge of routes, weather patterns, and coastal conditions would have been essential for maintaining continuity in the system. In such a world, expertise becomes a form of currency more valuable than material goods. The stability of this network, however, is never absolute. Even at its peak, it remains vulnerable to environmental change. Shifts in climate can alter wind patterns, ice coverage, and sea conditions. A route that is reliable for generations can become dangerous within a relatively short period of time. Archaeological evidence suggests that such disruptions did occur, forcing adjustments in settlement patterns and maritime behaviour. In some areas, continuity is maintained through adaptation. Routes shift rather than disappear. New hubs emerge to replace those that become less accessible. In others, the disruption appears more severe, with long gaps in activity suggesting temporary abandonment of certain coastal zones. These fluctuations do not indicate collapse, but they do reveal the fragile balance on which the system depends. One of the most intriguing aspects of this peak phase is the apparent resilience of maritime knowledge despite these disruptions. Shipbuilding techniques, navigation skills, and coastal familiarity persist even when specific routes change. This suggests that knowledge is not tied to fixed geography, but carried through people who adapt it to new conditions. The system survives because its core component is mobile. As evidence accumulates, a picture emerges of a northern world deeply shaped by maritime connectivity. The sea is not a boundary separating distinct cultures. It is the medium through which those cultures interact, overlap, and evolve. The scale of this interaction may never have been centralized, but it was extensive enough to shape the development of entire regions. And yet, even at this apparent peak, something remains absent. There is no definitive moment of recognition, no written acknowledgement of this system as a unified whole. It exists only through reconstruction, through patterns inferred from fragments that survive by chance. The people who lived within it likely did not perceive it as an empire or a network. For them, it was simply the way the world worked. What remains now is not the system itself, but its residue. Scattered timbers beneath the seabed, submerged harbour traces along eroding coastlines, cultural echoes embedded in later traditions that would eventually become part of the Viking Age. The peak of this maritime world is not a point in time that can be clearly defined. It is a long, sustained condition of movement, now partially erased but not entirely lost. And somewhere beneath the shifting northern waters, that condition still lingers in fragments waiting to be read. Memory in the northern world does not always survive as memory. It survives as distortion. Stories shift as they are carried across generations, changing shape each time they are retold, until what once may have been a record of lived experience becomes something closer to myth. Yet even in myth, fragments of older realities often persist, embedded like sediment in the structure of later narratives. The challenge is not to separate truth from fiction completely, but to recognize when fiction begins to carry the weight of something older than itself. In the centuries that follow the height of the Viking Age, written sources begin to appear that describe the northern world in ways that are already layered with interpretation. Sagas, chronicles, and oral traditions recorded later by medieval scribes present a landscape filled with seafaring journeys, distant voyages, and encounters with mysterious peoples. Most of these accounts are filtered through the cultural lens of their time, shaped by political realities and evolving identities, but occasionally they preserve echoes of something that does not quite fit the known historical framework. Some of these narratives refer, indirectly and inconsistently, to peoples who lived along the coasts before the rise of recognizable Norse kingdoms. These groups are often unnamed or described in vague terms, sometimes portrayed as skilled navigators, sometimes as traders, and at other times as semi-mythical figures associated with remote islands or distant northern waters. The inconsistencies suggest not a single source, but multiple layers of memory compressed into storytelling traditions that have lost their original context. It is within these blurred references that scholars sometimes glimpse possible reflections of the earlier maritime system suggested by archaeological evidence. Not direct descriptions, but distorted impressions. A people who knew the sea deeply, but left no written records. A network of travel routes remembered as legendary journeys. Coastal regions described as once more interconnected than they appear in the historical present. None of these accounts are reliable in isolation, but together they form a pattern that is difficult to dismiss entirely. What complicates interpretation further is the tendency of later cultures to overwrite earlier histories with their own identities. As political structures become more centralized and written language more widespread, older systems of organization are often reframed or absorbed into new narratives. In the case of the northern world, the expansion of Viking societies creates a dominant cultural memory that naturally becomes the reference point for everything that preceded it. What came before is often described only in relation to what followed. Yet archaeology resists this simplification. material evidence does not conform to narrative convenience. Ship fragments, harbour traces, and coastal settlements continue to indicate sustained maritime activity long before the emergence of Viking expansion. These physical remains do not disappear simply because later stories fail to preserve them accurately. Instead, they stand as independent witnesses to a past that is only partially reflected in written tradition. In some cases, later sources may even preserve indirect knowledge of earlier systems without recognizing their origin. Descriptions of sea routes, navigation practices, and seasonal voyages in medieval texts sometimes appear more advanced than what would be expected if they were entirely developed within the Viking period alone. This raises the possibility that certain maritime skills and traditions were inherited from older, less visible systems rather than created anew. Oral tradition plays a crucial role in this transmission. In societies where writing is limited or absent, knowledge is preserved through repetition, storytelling, and practice. But oral systems are vulnerable to transformation. Over time, practical information can become symbolic. Navigational knowledge can turn into mythic journeys. Real places can become legendary locations. The sea, which once functioned as a structured network of movement, becomes a setting for stories that no longer retain their original technical meaning. This transformation does not erase the past, it obscures it, and in doing so, it creates layers of meaning that overlap rather than replace one another. A single story may contain both historical memory and later reinterpretation, intertwined in ways that are difficult to untangle. For researchers, this means that myth cannot be dismissed outright, but must be approached as a potential carrier of fragmented historical knowledge. One of the recurring motifs in northern oral traditions is the idea of journeys into distant, often cold and fog-shrouded regions across the sea. These journeys are sometimes described as dangerous, requiring specialized knowledge of weather, currents, and coastline navigation. While the mythological framing is clear, the underlying structure of such narratives aligns surprisingly well with the environmental realities of northern maritime travel. This does not confirm historical accuracy, but it does suggest that lived experience may have influenced the formation of these stories. In parallel, certain archaeological findings appear to correspond loosely with these narrative patterns. Remote coastal sites show evidence of intermittent occupation that does not fit neatly into settled agricultural models. These sites may have functioned as temporary stops along extended maritime routes, places where travellers rested, repaired vessels, or exchanged goods before continuing onward. Over time, such locations could acquire cultural significance that later evolves into mythological association. The challenge lies in distinguishing between continuity and reinterpretation. A place that was once a functional harbour may later be remembered as a mythical destination. A real seafaring route may be preserved as a symbolic journey. The transformation is not accidental. It reflects the way human memory adapts to changing social and political contexts. As Viking societies expanded and consolidated power across the northern world, their cultural narratives naturally became dominant. Earlier systems, if they were not fully integrated into this new structure, risked being absorbed, reinterpreted, or forgotten. What remains visible today is therefore a mixture of inherited knowledge and cultural reconstruction, layered over whatever came before. The earlier maritime system inferred from archaeological evidence may have been one of the sources feeding into this process. Its roots, technologies, and practices could have been gradually incorporated into later traditions, without being explicitly recognized as originating from a distinct earlier phase. In this way, Continuity persists even when historical identity is lost. But even if this is the case, large gaps remain. Myth can preserve fragments, but it cannot preserve structure in full. Archaeology can reveal structure, but not meaning. Between these two forms of evidence lies a space that remains only partially accessible. It is within this space that the forgotten seafaring world of the northern seas continues to exist, not as a fully recoverable civilization, but as an echo reconstructed from what survives on land, in water, and in story. And as both myth and material evidence continue to be re-examined, the line between remembered history and reconstructed possibility remains deliberately thin. The sea does not change suddenly, but human life often does. In the northern world, where survival depends on a delicate balance between land, water, and climate, even a subtle shift in temperature or wind patterns can reshape entire systems of movement. What once was reliable becomes uncertain. What once was predictable becomes dangerous. And in such an environment, maritime networks are among the first structures to feel the pressure. Paleoclimate data from ice cores and marine sediments suggests that the centuries surrounding the transition into the Viking Age were not environmentally stable. There were fluctuations in temperature, shifts in storm frequency, and changes in sea ice distribution that altered the accessibility of key northern routes. These changes were not uniform across the region. Some areas experienced gradual cooling, while others saw increased variability in seasonal conditions. The result was not a single collapse, but a patchwork of environmental stress. For a maritime system built on repetition and seasonal rhythm, this kind of instability is particularly disruptive. Routes that depend on predictable wind patterns become unreliable. Coastal passages that once remained ice-free for extended periods begin to close earlier in the year. Harbours that were once safely accessible may become exposed to stronger storms or shifting sediment deposits. In such conditions, even a well-established network of maritime movement begins to strain. Archaeological evidence reflects these pressures indirectly. Certain coastal sites show abrupt changes in occupation patterns. Locations that had been used consistently for generations appear to be abandoned or significantly reduced in activity. At the same time, new sites emerge elsewhere, often in more sheltered or strategically favourable positions. This suggests adaptation rather than immediate collapse, but it also indicates disruption in long-standing spatial continuity. Ship fragments from later phases show subtle but noticeable changes in construction emphasis. Some vessels appear more heavily reinforced, suggesting a response to rougher sea conditions. Others show signs of reduced size or modified hull design, possibly reflecting shorter or more localized voyages. These changes do not represent a break in tradition, but they do suggest adjustment to a changing environment. The maritime system that once functioned as a stable network of interaction begins to fragment under these conditions, not in a dramatic or singular moment, but gradually, as reliability decreases and alternative strategies emerge. Communities that once depended on long-distance sea travel may begin to rely more heavily on inland routes or localized exchange networks. The sea remains important, but its role shifts. In this transitional phase, knowledge becomes unevenly distributed. Some groups retain advanced maritime skills, while others gradually lose regular access to long-distance navigation. This creates pockets of expertise that may persist even as the broader system weakens. Skilled navigators, shipbuilders, and coastal traders become increasingly valuable, but their ability to maintain a cohesive network diminishes as the environmental framework supporting that network erodes. One of the most significant consequences of this shift is the alteration of connectivity. Where once there was a relatively continuous chain of maritime contact along the northern coastline, there now appear to be breaks in transmission. Certain regions maintain strong seafaring traditions, while others show reduced maritime activity and increased inland focus. Over time, this fragmentation changes the overall structure of interaction across the north. The reasons for these changes are not purely environmental. Social and demographic factors also play a role. Population movements, resource pressures, and local conflict can all contribute to the weakening of established routes. When combined with environmental instability, these pressures accelerate the transformation of the maritime system. Yet even in periods of disruption, the sea does not cease to function as a connector. It remains the fastest and often the most efficient route between distant points. This means that maritime activity does not disappear. It reorganizes. Smaller, more localized networks may replace broader systems, maintaining continuity on a reduced scale. The structure changes, but the underlying logic of movement remains intact. It is in this context that the later emergence of Viking maritime expansion becomes more understandable. Rather than appearing out of nowhere, it may represent the re-expansion or reorganization of earlier seafaring traditions that had persisted through periods of fragmentation. The skills required for long-distance navigation, shipbuilding, and coastal coordination do not need to be reinvented. They can survive in reduced form, waiting for conditions that allow them to scale again. However, this interpretation remains cautious. The archaeological record does not provide a single clear transition point between the earlier maritime system and the Viking Age. Instead, it shows gradual shifts, overlaps, and regional variations that resist simple classification. Some areas appear to maintain continuity, while others show clear discontinuities. The picture is uneven, reflecting the complexity of real historical processes. What is clear is that environmental change played a central role in reshaping the northern maritime world. It altered the conditions under which movement was possible, and in doing so, it reshaped the structure of human interaction across the region. The sea remained constant in its presence, but not in its behavior, and for societies dependent on its stability, this mattered profoundly. The disappearance of large-scale coherence in earlier maritime networks does not necessarily mean the disappearance of knowledge. Instead, it suggests transformation. Skills, roots, and traditions may have persisted in localized forms, even as the broader system became less integrated. Over time, these fragments could be recombined under new conditions, forming the basis for later developments. This cyclical pattern of expansion, fragmentation, and reorganization is not unique to the northern seas. It reflects a broader principle in human history, where environmental stability allows for integration and instability leads to decentralization. The difference in the northern case lies in the severity of environmental constraints and the centrality of maritime movement to survival. As the system enters this phase of disruption, the archaeological record becomes more difficult to interpret. Gaps in settlement continuity increase. Material culture becomes more regionally diverse. Direct connections between sites become harder to trace. The sense of a unified maritime network fades, replaced by a more fragmented and localized pattern of activity. And yet, beneath this fragmentation, traces of continuity remain. Shipbuilding traditions persist in modified forms. Coastal knowledge is preserved in isolated communities. Routes are remembered, even if used less frequently. The system does not disappear entirely. It contracts, disperses, and waits. What emerges from this period is not the end of a maritime world, but its transformation under pressure. A system once wide and interconnected becomes narrower and more regional, but the underlying relationship between people and sea remains unchanged. The ocean continues to shape movement, survival, and connection, even when the scale of that connection is reduced. In this sense, the collapse of the earlier maritime network is not a disappearance, but a reconfiguration. And within that reconfiguration lies the possibility that older knowledge did not vanish, but was simply carried forward in altered form, ready to reappear when conditions once again allowed it to expand. Collapse is rarely a single moment in time. In the northern maritime world, it is better understood as a slow unweaving of connections that once held distant coastal communities in a shared rhythm. The roots still exist on the water, but the certainty behind them begins to fade. What was once predictable movement becomes conditional, dependent on shifting weather, reduced coordination, and the growing unpredictability of access to safe harbours. As environmental instability intensifies, the fragile balance that sustained long-distance maritime interaction begins to break down in uneven ways. Some coastal regions maintain continuity longer than others, particularly those with sheltered waters or access to inland resources that reduce dependence on external exchange. Other regions, more exposed to open sea conditions, experience sharper declines in maritime activity. The result is not a uniform collapse, but a patchwork of persistence and disappearance. Archaeological layers from this transitional period show clear signs of contraction. Sites that once supported repeated maritime use show reduced material accumulation. Harbour traces become less pronounced. Ship-related debris appears more sporadically, suggesting fewer voyages or longer intervals between them. In some locations, activity stops altogether, leaving behind only the structural remnants of what once functioned as active nodes in a wider network. Yet even as the system weakens, it does not vanish cleanly. Instead, it fragments into smaller, more localized structures of interaction. Coastal communities continue to engage in short-range travel, but the long-distance coherence that once linked distant regions across the northern seas becomes increasingly difficult to trace. The sense of a continuous maritime world gives way to isolated pockets of activity, separated by stretches of reduced contact. One of the most telling indicators of this fragmentation is the changing nature of ship remains. Earlier vessels, inferred from more coherent structural fragments, suggest designs optimized for regular long-distance use. In contrast, later fragments show increased variation in size and construction technique. Some vessels appear smaller and more suited to local waters, while others show reinforcement that may reflect attempts to compensate for harsher or less predictable conditions. This diversification suggests adaptation, but also the absence of a unified design tradition being consistently maintained across regions. The weakening of maritime networks has broader consequences for the flow of materials and knowledge. Trade goods that once moved along extended routes now circulate within more restricted zones. Exotic materials become rarer in inland sites that were previously connected to coastal exchange systems. In turn, coastal communities become more self-reliant, reducing the scale and frequency of long-distance interactions. This contraction does not imply cultural stagnation. On the contrary, regional differentiation often increases during periods of reduced connectivity. Local traditions evolve independently, shaped by specific environmental and social conditions. However, what is lost is the coherence of a shared maritime framework that once linked these variations into a broader system. The causes of this breakdown are multiple and interwoven. Environmental change continues to play a significant role, but it is reinforced by demographic shifts and possible social disruptions. Population movements may alter settlement patterns, while local conflicts or competition for resources can further strain existing networks. In such conditions, maintaining long-distance coordination becomes increasingly difficult without centralized structures, which, as earlier evidence suggests, may not have existed in a formal sense. What remains particularly important in this phase is the resilience of maritime knowledge at a local level. Even as broader networks weaken, communities retain practical skills related to boat construction, navigation, and coastal survival. These skills do not disappear abruptly. Instead, they are gradually reoriented towards shorter routes and more immediate needs. The sea remains central, but its role becomes more localized. In some regions, there is evidence of continuity in ritual or symbolic practices associated with maritime life. Burials containing boat-related artifacts continue in modified forms. Coastal sites retain cultural significance even when their economic role diminishes. This suggests that maritime identity persists beyond the functional decline of large-scale networks, embedded in cultural memory and local tradition. Over time, however, the reduction in scale becomes more pronounced. The long-distance system that once connected vast stretches of coastline becomes increasingly difficult to reconstruct in the archaeological record. Connections that once spanned regions are replaced by localized clusters of activity with limited external reach. The sea, while still physically connecting these regions, no longer functions as a coherent unifying system across them. It is in this fragmented landscape that later historical developments begin to take shape. The emergence of more recognizable cultural and political structures in the northern world does not occur in a vacuum. It arises from a background of prior maritime knowledge, partial continuity, and localized adaptation. Some of the skills and traditions from earlier systems persist, even if their original organizational framework has been lost. This raises an important interpretive challenge. What appears in later periods as the beginning of a new maritime expansion may in fact be the reactivation of older capabilities that survived in reduced or transformed forms. Knowledge does not need to remain continuously active to persist. It can lie dormant within communities, preserved through practice at smaller scales until conditions allow for expansion once again. The archaeological record supports this possibility indirectly. Certain shipbuilding techniques, navigational practices, and coastal settlement patterns show signs of deep continuity, even if their broader context changes. This continuity is not uniform, but it is persistent enough to suggest that the underlying maritime knowledge system was never fully erased, only reconfigured. Still, caution is necessary. Continuity in technique does not automatically imply continuity in organization. A method of construction can survive independently of the system that once spread it. Similarly, knowledge of routes can persist without the existence of a broader network connecting them. The challenge lies in distinguishing between survival of fragments and survival of structure. What becomes clear, however, is that the so-called collapse of the earlier maritime world is not an endpoint. It is a transition into a different configuration of the same underlying relationship between people and sea. The scale of interaction changes, but the dependence on maritime movement does not disappear. Instead, it adapts to new constraints. As this phase concludes, the northern seas enter a period of reduced but persistent activity. The great coherence of earlier networks is no longer visible, but its remnants remain embedded in local practices, scattered material traces, and environmental familiarity. The system does not end with a singular break. It dissolves gradually, leaving behind fragments that will later be reassembled in new historical forms. And beneath this slow dissolution, the sea continues to preserve more than it reveals, holding within its depths the incomplete record of what once moved across its surface. Rediscovery does not begin with certainty. It begins with small contradictions in the present, details that refuse to fit neatly into established historical timelines. In the northern maritime world, these contradictions begin to accumulate when modern archaeological techniques are applied more systematically to coastal and underwater environments. What was once assumed to be scattered and isolated evidence starts to reveal patterns that extend beyond the limits of earlier interpretation. Underwater surveys, particularly those using advanced sonar mapping and sediment analysis, begin to uncover linear formations that do not align with natural seabed structures. These features are not dramatic or easily recognizable as ruins. They are subtle, often partially buried under layers of sediment, but their geometry suggests intentional arrangement. In some areas, the seabed appears subtly shaped in ways consistent with repeated anchoring, dredging, or construction activity that predates known historical occupation of those waters. At the same time, coastal erosion events continue to expose fragments of timber and structural remains that do not correspond to documented shipbuilding traditions from the Viking Age or later medieval periods. When these finds are analysed in combination with older bog-preserved materials, a broader picture begins to emerge. The evidence does not point to a single lost civilization, but to a long-duration maritime tradition that operated across a wide geographic range. One of the most significant developments in modern interpretation is the realization that many of these finds are not anomalous in isolation. Instead, they become meaningful when placed within a wider spatial framework. A fragment of timber in one coastal region may correspond in construction technique to material found hundreds of kilometers away. A seabed anomaly in one fjord may align with patterns detected in another. Individually, these pieces are ambiguous. Together, they suggest continuity of practice across distance. This shift in interpretation requires a change in perspective. Earlier archaeological models tended to focus on discrete cultures tied to specific regions and time periods. The emerging evidence from northern maritime contexts challenges this approach. Instead of sharply defined cultural units, what appears is a network of overlapping traditions that persist, transform, and reappear across time. The boundaries between periods become less distinct than previously assumed. As research deepens, attention turns increasingly toward the mechanics of this continuity. How did knowledge persist across generations in a system without centralized documentation? One answer lies in the durability of practical maritime skills. Shipbuilding, navigation, and coastal survival techniques are not easily lost once embedded in lived experience. They are transmitted through apprenticeship, repetition, and direct engagement with the environment. As long as communities continue to use the sea, these skills remain active. Another factor is the stability of certain environmental constraints. The northern seas, despite long-term climatic fluctuations, maintain consistent structural features, coastlines shaped by fjords and islands, seasonal ice patterns, and predictable wind systems. These features create a framework within which maritime knowledge remains relevant across long periods of time. Even when specific social structures change, the environmental logic of navigation persists. This helps explain why certain technological elements appear to survive across what seem to be discontinuous historical phases. Shipbuilding techniques, in particular, show patterns of long-term persistence with gradual modification. Rather than being reinvented repeatedly, they evolve incrementally. retaining core principles while adapting to new conditions. This continuity suggests that maritime knowledge is deeply embedded in the lived experience of coastal populations. In some cases, however, the evidence suggests more than simple survival of technique. There are indications of structured repetition in harbour use, vessel repair practices, and coastal settlement organisation that imply ongoing coordination over extended periods. These patterns are difficult to attribute solely to coincidence or independent adaptation. They suggest that some form of shared maritime understanding persisted even as broader social structures changed. Yet this persistence does not necessarily imply the survival of a unified system in its original form. Instead, it may reflect a gradual transformation in which elements of an older maritime tradition were absorbed into new cultural and social frameworks. As populations shifted and reorganized, useful knowledge was retained, while its original context was gradually forgotten. This process of selective retention is critical to understanding the fragmented nature of the archaeological record. What survives is not the system as it once existed, but the parts that remained useful enough to be preserved through practice. Over time, these fragments can appear disconnected from their origins, even if they once belonged to a more coherent whole. In this context, the distinction between discovery and reconstruction becomes increasingly blurred. Modern archaeology does not uncover a complete past. It assembles partial evidence into models that remain inherently provisional. Each new finding has the potential to adjust the framework, but never to finalize it. The northern maritime world, as it is currently understood, is therefore not a fixed historical entity, but an evolving interpretation of incomplete data. Despite these limitations, the convergence of multiple lines of evidence is difficult to ignore. Ship fragments, coastal settlement patterns, seabed anomalies, and material distributions all point towards sustained maritime activity over a long pre-Viking timeline. While the exact nature of the system remains uncertain, its existence as a significant organizing factor in northern human life is increasingly difficult to dismiss. What remains unresolved is scale. How extensive was this maritime connectivity? Did it function as a loosely connected set of regional networks, or as something more integrated than current models allow? The evidence supports aspects of both interpretations without fully confirming either. This ambiguity is not a failure of research, but a reflection of the complexity of the system itself. As new technologies continue to improve underwater mapping and archaeological detection, the possibility of further discoveries remains high. Much of the northern seabed has not yet been systematically surveyed, and coastal regions continue to shift under the influence of erosion and climate change. Each of these processes has the potential to reveal additional fragments of the past. In this ongoing process of rediscovery, the northern seas remain both archive and eraser. They preserve what is buried beneath them, but they also obscure it through constant movement. The maritime world that once existed here is not gone in a single sense. It is distributed across time, depth, and fragmentary evidence, waiting to be assembled into a form that can be partially understood, but never fully completed. And so the story continues not as a recovered whole, but as an expanding field of possibility shaped by every new trace that emerges from the water. Every reconstruction of the past eventually reaches a point where certainty begins to thin out, not because evidence disappears entirely, but because it begins to support multiple interpretations at once. The northern maritime system enters this stage when scholars try to define what it actually was. The same fragments that suggest a coordinated network of movement can also be read as overlapping regional traditions. The same harbour traces that imply structure can also be explained as long-term accumulation of repeated local use. Nothing contradicts itself, yet nothing resolves into a single clear identity. This is where competing theories begin to take shape. One interpretation argues that what has been uncovered is not a unified system at all, but a collection of independent coastal cultures that happen to develop similar maritime solutions due to shared environmental pressures. In this view, similarity is not evidence of connection, but of convergence. Cold waters, unpredictable weather, and fragmented geography would naturally produce comparable ship designs and coastal strategies without requiring any deeper organizational link. Another interpretation pushes in the opposite direction, suggesting that the consistency of certain patterns is too strong to be accidental. The repeated presence of standardized construction methods, recurring harbor layouts, and long-distance material distribution patterns implies at least some degree of coordination beyond isolated innovation. In this reading, the maritime world is not a coincidence of parallel adaptations, but a loosely integrated system sustained by shared knowledge and repeated interaction. Neither explanation fully excludes the other. In fact, both may be partially correct. The northern seas may have supported a hybrid structure in which localized adaptation and broader connectivity existed simultaneously. Certain regions could have developed independently while still participating in intermittent exchange networks that transmitted ideas, technologies, and goods across long distances. This hybrid model helps explain one of the most persistent challenges in interpreting the archaeological record in consistency and scale. Some sites show strong evidence of repeated long-distance contact, while others appear entirely local in character. If a single centralized system had existed, one might expect more uniformity, but if only isolated cultures existed, one would expect less consistency in shipbuilding and maritime practice. The reality sits uneasily between these expectations. Linguistic evidence, though limited for this period, adds another layer of complexity. Later languages in the northern region contain maritime vocabulary that appears unusually rich and structurally nuanced, suggesting long-term specialization in seafaring life. However, tracing the origins of these terms is difficult. Words evolve, shift meaning, and sometimes merge from multiple sources, making it nearly impossible to map them cleanly onto specific prehistoric cultures. Still, the density of maritime terminology hints at a deep historical relationship between language and sea-based life. Material culture continues to provide the most stable line of evidence. Across different regions and time layers, certain functional artifacts appear repeatedly in maritime contexts. These include tools for rope production, fish processing equipment, and standardized fastening components used in ship construction. The recurrence of these items suggests that despite regional variation, there was a shared technological foundation underlying northern seafaring practices. Yet even here, interpretation is not straightforward. Shared tools do not necessarily imply shared identity. They may simply reflect the limited range of effective solutions available in a harsh environment. When survival depends on efficiency, innovation often converges towards similar outcomes. The sea, in this sense, acts as both a constraint and a teacher, shaping human behavior through necessity rather than design. What complicates the picture further is the temporal dimension. The archaeological record does not show a single stable system persisting unchanged over time. Instead, it reveals phases of intensity and decline, periods of expansion followed by contraction. In some eras, maritime activity appears highly integrated across regions. In others, it becomes more localized and fragmented. This cyclical pattern suggests that whatever system existed was not static, but responsive to broader environmental and social forces. These fluctuations make it difficult to define the northern maritime world as a single historical entity. It may be more accurate to think of it as a recurring condition rather than a fixed structure. At certain times, conditions align to produce high levels of connectivity. At others, those connections weaken or break apart. The underlying knowledge remains, but its expression varies depending on circumstances. This perspective also changes how the idea of a forgotten empire must be understood. If such a system ever existed, it may not have resembled an empire in the traditional sense at all. Instead, it could have been a temporary alignment of practices, technologies, and movements that created the appearance of unity without requiring centralized control. In this sense, the term empire becomes a metaphor for scale rather than governance. Still, the temptation to impose structure on the evidence remains strong. Human cognition naturally seeks patterns, hierarchies, and narratives that provide coherence. But the Northern Maritime record resists full consolidation. It offers fragments that connect in multiple directions, forming networks of possibility rather than a single definitive map. Some scholars suggest that this ambiguity is not a flaw in the evidence, but a reflection of how pre-modern systems actually functioned in complex environments. Instead of rigid organizations, many ancient societies may have operated through flexible, overlapping networks that adapted continuously to changing conditions. In such systems, boundaries are porous, identities are layered, and continuity depends more on practice than on formal structure. The northern seas are particularly suited to this kind of organization. Their geography encourages movement, their climate demands adaptability, and their resources are distributed in patterns that reward mobility over permanence. In such a setting, it is entirely plausible that multiple forms of maritime organization coexisted, intersected, and evolved over time without ever resolving into a single unified structure. As interpretation continues to evolve, the focus shifts away from searching for a definitive identity and toward understanding relationships between fragments. The question is no longer simply what this system was, but how it functioned across different scales and conditions. This approach accepts ambiguity as part of the historical reality, rather than something to be eliminated. And within that ambiguity, a different kind of clarity begins to emerge. Not the clarity of a single narrative, but the clarity of patterns that repeat without fully resolving into one explanation. The northern maritime world remains partially defined, partially inferred, and partially unknown. It exists at the intersection of evidence and absence, where structure can be seen but never completely fixed. What remains, then, is not resolution, but perspective, a way of seeing the past not as a finished story, but as a set of overlapping possibilities shaped by environment, movement, and time. By the time the Viking Age begins to take recognizable shape in the historical record, the northern seas are already carrying centuries of accumulated movement beneath their surface. What appears in later sources as a sudden emergence of seafaring expansion is, when viewed against the archaeological background, less an origin than a transformation of something that was already deeply embedded in coastal life. The question is not whether maritime capability existed before this period, but how much of it was inherited, adapted, or reassembled from earlier, less visible systems. The material evidence suggests that certain core elements of seafaring practice did not arise abruptly. Ship construction techniques, coastal navigation knowledge, and seasonal travel patterns show signs of deep continuity. Even when ship designs evolve into the more recognizable forms associated with Viking expansion, underlying principles remain consistent: hull flexibility, shallow draft construction, and coastal adaptability persist across time, suggesting that the foundation of this maritime expertise predates its most famous historical expression. This continuity does not imply a single uninterrupted civilization. Instead, it points to the persistence of knowledge systems within populations that underwent repeated cycles of change. Communities shift, migrate, fragment, and recombine, but practical knowledge survives through use. A method of building a seaworthy vessel does not require institutional preservation. It only requires that people continue to live in environments where such vessels are necessary. In this sense, the maritime traditions visible in the Viking Age may represent a reconcentration of knowledge that had previously been more widely distributed. During earlier periods of fragmentation, as suggested by environmental and archaeological evidence, maritime activity becomes localized and uneven. Some regions maintain strong seafaring practices, while others reduce their dependence on long-distance travel. Over time, these pockets of expertise can persist independently, preserving core technologies even as broader systems dissolve. When conditions later shift again, those preserved capabilities can expand rapidly. This does not require rediscovery in the strict sense. It requires reactivation. Skills that were never fully lost can be scaled up when environmental, social, or economic conditions make expansion possible once more. The emergence of Viking maritime activity may therefore reflect not the invention of new seafaring systems, but the amplification of older ones under new conditions. Archaeological parallels support this interpretation in subtle ways. Certain shipbuilding techniques associated with Viking vessels appear in earlier, less complete forms in bog and coastal deposits. These do not show full standardization, but they do demonstrate foundational methods that are clearly compatible with later developments. The transition between phases is gradual rather than abrupt, suggesting evolution rather than replacement. At the same time, regional variation remains significant. Not all coastal areas show the same degree of continuity. Some regions appear to contribute more strongly to later maritime expansion, while others fade in archaeological visibility. This uneven distribution of continuity suggests that the maritime world before the Viking Age was never uniform. Instead, it functioned as a mosaic of overlapping traditions with varying degrees of persistence. The idea of legacy becomes particularly important here. What survives into later periods is not necessarily the full structure of earlier systems, but selected components that remain useful. Shipbuilding techniques, navigational knowledge, and coastal familiarity are among the most durable elements because they are directly tied to survival and mobility. Other aspects of earlier maritime organization, such as specific route systems or localized exchange networks, may not survive in recognizable form, even if their influence persists indirectly. In this way, the Viking maritime expansion can be understood as both continuation and transformation. It continues earlier traditions of seafaring adapted to northern environments, but it also transforms them into a more visible and historically documented form. The difference lies not necessarily in capability, but in scale and coherence. The reasons for this shift in scale are complex. Environmental conditions play a role, but so do social and demographic factors. Population growth, increased interaction with other regions, and evolving political structures may all contribute to a renewed capacity for long-distance maritime activity. When these factors align, the latent potential within existing knowledge systems can expand rapidly. This expansion, however, should not obscure the depth of what preceded it. The archaeological record increasingly suggests that the foundations of northern seafaring were already well established long before the Viking Age. What changes is not the existence of maritime capability, but its visibility in the historical record. Earlier systems operate without written documentation, leaving only material traces that require reconstruction. This raises a broader interpretive challenge. Historical narratives often privilege moments of expansion, documentation, and political consolidation. Periods of fragmentation or reduced visibility are more difficult to represent, even if they are equally significant in shaping long-term development. The northern maritime world before the Vikings belongs largely to this less visible category, where activity is continuous but unevenly recorded. Within this context, the idea of a forgotten seafaring empire becomes more symbolic than literal. It does not refer to a centralized political entity, but to the cumulative effect of sustained maritime interaction over time. The impression of scale arises not from organization, but from repetition across generations. Movement itself becomes the defining feature, rather than the institutions that might later be associated with it. As this perspective develops, the boundary between archaeology and historical imagination becomes more fluid. Reconstruction requires inference, and inference always carries uncertainty. Yet even within this uncertainty, certain patterns remain stable: the importance of the sea, the persistence of shipbuilding traditions, and the long-term connectivity of northern coastal regions. The Viking Age, then, does not stand apart from this earlier world as a sudden beginning. It stands as a phase in a much longer continuum of maritime adaptation. Its prominence in historical sources is due not only to change on the ground, but to change in record-keeping. What becomes written history is only a fraction of what once existed in practice. And so, beneath the visible surface of recorded events, the deeper maritime world continues to extend backward in time, partially reconstructed, partially inferred, and partially still hidden beneath the shifting layers of sea and sediment. The northern seas hold no memory in the way human societies understand memory. They do not preserve events in sequence, nor do they distinguish between what is recent and what is ancient. Instead, they accumulate traces, layer upon layer, as currents shift sediment and storms disturb what lies beneath. In this way, the past is never fully gone. It is only redistributed, broken apart, and made intermittently visible when conditions briefly allow. Across the long arc of evidence gathered from ship fragments, coastal settlements, bog-preserved timber, and submerged seabed formations, a single idea continues to reappear in different forms. The northern world before the Vikings was not empty, nor was it primitive in any simple sense. It was active, interconnected, and shaped by a maritime logic that operated across vast distances without relying on centralized authority or written record. What survives is not a single civilization, but a pattern of sustained movement that once linked communities through the sea. Yet that pattern is never fully recoverable. Each discovery reveals structure, but also reinforces absence. A ship fragment suggests a tradition, but not its full organization. A harbour trace suggests repeated use, but not the identity of those who built it. A distribution of materials suggests exchange, but not the agreements that enabled it. The system can be reconstructed in outline, but never completed in detail. What emerges most clearly is not the image of a forgotten empire, but something more elusive, a maritime condition that persisted across centuries, shaped by necessity rather than design. People along these coasts learned to move with the sea because survival required it. Over time, that movement created networks of interaction, knowledge transfer, and material exchange that spanned regions later thought of as separate worlds. But these networks were never fixed. They expanded, contracted, fragmented and reformed in response to shifting environmental and social pressures. In this sense, continuity in the North is not linear, it is cyclical and adaptive. Knowledge does not disappear, it changes scale. Systems do not end, they reorganize. The Viking Age, when it appears more clearly in written sources, is not the sudden beginning of maritime capability, but one visible expression of a much longer and more complex history of adaptation to the sea. Beneath this visible layer lies a deeper accumulation of forgotten structures, not ruins in the traditional sense, but submerged patterns of activity that no longer have direct narrative representation. They persist in material traces and environmental modifications, in subtle consistencies across distant archaeological sites, and in the inherited techniques that survived into later periods without preserving their full origin stories. The sea itself plays a dual role in this preservation. It erases by erosion, corrosion, and submersion, but it also protects by sealing, burying, and isolating. What is lost in clarity is gained in survival. Timbers that would have decayed on land endure in bogs and seabeds. Coastal structures that would have been dismantled or repurposed remain partially intact beneath sediment. The result is a fragmented archive that must be assembled without ever becoming complete. Even the idea of a system may be too rigid for what once existed. The evidence suggests something more fluid, overlapping practices, shared technologies, and repeated interactions that created temporary coherence without requiring permanent structure. At times, this coherence may have been strong enough to resemble unity. At other times, it may have dissolved into localized independence. Both states can exist within the same long historical continuum. What remains consistent throughout is the centrality of the sea. It is not merely a backdrop, but the organizing medium of life across the northern coasts. It defines what is possible in terms of movement, trade, communication, and survival. Any attempt to understand the societies that lived within this environment must therefore begin with water as the primary axis of organization, rather than land. And yet, despite all reconstruction, much of this world remains permanently out of reach, not because it was insignificant, but because it was never fully recorded in forms that survive. Its traces are real, but incomplete. Its patterns are visible, but not fully legible. It exists at the boundary between knowledge and loss. What the fragments ultimately suggest is not a lost empire waiting to be fully recovered, but a deeper truth about human history in unstable environments. Large-scale coherence can exist without formal structure. Complex networks can operate without centralized control. And entire systems of movement and interaction can shape regions for centuries without leaving behind a single defining narrative. The northern seas still carry that legacy, not as a story that can be fully retold, but as a set of impressions embedded in the material world. Each storm that disturbs the seabed, each excavation along a shifting coastline, and each fragment lifted from peat and sediment adds another brief moment of clarity to something that will never be fully complete. In the end, the forgotten seafaring world of the North is not a lost empire waiting to be rediscovered in full. It is a reminder that history is often larger than the forms in which it survives. What remains is not a finished picture, but a horizon of fragments stretching across water, time and silence still slowly coming into view and still never entirely resolved.